Tiny, Awful Things. Stories from the Witch CAFÉ, the Forever Horror. Welcome one, welcome all to the Moonstone. Please enjoy today's special pumpkin ghoul pie with, may I suggest, a cup of Frankenspice coffee, while I do my best to entertain you with tonight's story. This one comes from a challenge I received from friends to tell a scary story that could go on forever. I'm not sure if it's as scary as it's gross, but it's certainly fitting for Halloween, and it takes place in medieval Europe. I call this one Tiny Awful Things, but my friends are telling me I should probably call it the Forever Horror. Have a listen, and let's discuss afterwards. There was no doubt Lucien was a coward. He was strong and clever and fast, but a coward nevertheless. That's what made being drafted into the king's army and marched into battle all the worse. Not wanting to put himself in harm's way, Lucien thought of a clever plan to avoid injury or even death. As soon as the horns blared and the infantry charged into the fray, Lucien executed his cowardly plan. He let loose a war cry like none other, rushed forward with his sword raised. Then, when no one was looking, when he heard the clash of iron and the agonized scream, tumbled to the ground where he played dead and hoped for the best. Lucien was so scared that despite the stink of rotting humanity, he kept his eyes closed for several days, until he felt someone or something tapping his shoulder. When he opened his eyes, he found himself staring up at a man in dark robes, holding a bloody scythe. Lucien was staring at death. Or at least, that's what he thought. Actually, it wasn't death at all, but a lower dimensional demon making the rounds, making mischief, pretending to be death, looking for someone, anyone, to torment. And if you know anything about lower dimensional demons, you know that they absolutely delight in tormenting cowards and narcissists. And so this lower dimensional demon stared at Lucien with glowing red eyes and told him his time had come, and asked if he had any last requests. Lucien, of course, extended a trembling hand and begged for his life. As the demon laughed and shook its ugly head, a thought came to Lucien, and he quickly begged for one last meal. The demon stepped back, smiled, and said he would entertain his last request. He told him he would allow him to live for as much time it would take for him to fill his belly with whatever he could find on this battlefield. No, not battlefield, buffet. This buffet of death. Lucien didn't know what to do. Certainly didn't want to commit any kind of sin before dying. He was about to surrender to his fate when he felt something squirm by his hand. He looked down, and that's when he saw the tiny, awful things squirming out of the bloated belly of a corpse, falling on his hand. Desperate, Lucien did the unthinkable. With a miserable sigh, he plunged his hand into the rotting belly, felt around the stinking, oozing innards, and soon pulled out a dangling white maggot. Swallowing a thickness in his throat, he held the tiny, awful thing up in the moonlight, then opened his mouth and let the maggot plop onto his tongue. The demon winced in disgust, laughed in disbelief, then said some words in a strange, unknown language. Lucien didn't understand any of it, but he thought he might have been cursed, as he strangely began to feel a great insatiable hunger for maggots. More than this, he even began savoring them as one might savor a fine wine or coffee, enjoying to his disbelief the aftertaste. I guess we can say that as a coffee bean soaks up the essence of the tree and land it grows upon, a maggot soaks up the essence of the corpse it feeds upon. Desperately tried to delay the inevitable. When Lucian finally finished savoring the maggot, the demon told him his time was up. But Lucian shook his head and said his belly wasn't full yet. Then he approached a corpse that had been crushed by a club. Blood and gore spilled out of the eye sockets like spaghetti and meatballs. And there, in the spaghetti and meatballs, tiny awful things squirmed. Lucian plucked another maggot and plopped it onto his greedy, salivating tongue. Robust, earthy, slimy. A velvety maggot that bursts with herbal notes and soothes with its fresh and bold character. The demon smiled at the coward and said his time was up. But Lucian shook his head and said his belly wasn't full yet. Then he approached a corpse that had been diced into small pieces by an axe. Chunks of bone and intestine festered in pools of blood like stew. And there in the stew, tiny awful things squirmed. Lucian plucked another maggot and plopped it onto his tongue. Bold, yet fruity, chewy, a sweet maggot with delicate hints of citrus. The demon smiled at the coward and said his time was up. Lucian shook his head and said his belly wasn't full yet. Then he approached a corpse that had been trampled by horses and marching soldiers. Pieces of skull and brain fermented in bile and blood, like a delicious dipping sauce for veggies. And there in the dipping sauce, tiny awful things squirmed. Lucian plucked another maggot and plopped it onto his tongue. Herbal, intense, mushy. A full-bodied maggot, rich in flavor. The demon smiled at the coward and said his time was up. And as you can imagine, the story goes on and on, because the demon enjoyed watching this coward grovel like a maggot for his life. And since it goes on and on, I would appreciate some help telling it, at least until we run out of tiny, awful things. Please pass this bowl of putrid guts and gore around the moonstone. I invite you to reach inside and choose a tiny, awful thing to savor. Please feel free to describe mushy details. Okay, I confess. They aren't real maggots, but slimy, sugary things soaking in warm brandy and pumpkin guts. But let's stick our hands in anyway and have a little fun to help us get into the spirit of Halloween.